Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. This week we begin in the Americas, where Colombia is responding to its strongest earthquake in more than a century. More than 250 people have been killed, and the disaster is also emerging as an early test for the country's newly inaugurated president. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we look at Russia's campaign against Ukraine's Black Sea ports and how it has effectively created a maritime blockade. We also assess what the assassination of a senior military intelligence figure could tell us about internal power struggles in Libya and why efforts to de-escalate the conflict in southern Lebanon remain stalled. In the wider Middle East, we examine the expansion of Israeli settler activity in the West Bank. What could follow when the 60-day US-Iran truce period formally ends, and how escalating fighting in Yemen could increase the threat to Saudi Arabia. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover Indonesia's worsening wildfire season as El Niño brings drier conditions and the prospect of further unrest in Pakistan-administered Kashmir following the postponement of voting in several constituencies. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where Colombia is dealing with the aftermath of its strongest earthquake in more than a century. At 7:34 a.m. local time on August 10th, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake was detected 5 kilometers east of San Jose del Palmar, in Colombia's Chocó department, at a depth of 107 kilometers, according to the United States Geological Survey. The earthquake was felt as far away as Venezuela and Ecuador. The latest figures show at least 265 people were killed and 3,494 injured, with 496 still missing. The earthquake destroyed more than 9,215 homes and damaged another 45,457. The worst damage occurred in Cali, Pereira, Manizales, and Quibdó. In Cali and Pereira, entire neighborhoods were effectively flattened, leaving widespread rubble. Rescuers used cranes, search dogs, and heavy machinery to clear the debris and search for survivors. In Chocó department, where the epicenter was located, rescue and cleanup efforts have been hampered by the remoteness of many communities in the conflict-ridden region. Many are accessible only by boat, air, or through the jungle. Residents evacuated buildings in northern Bogotá, more than 200 kilometers east of the epicenter, while buildings were also evacuated in Barranquilla. However, Bogotá Mayor Carlos Fernando Galán reported no structural damage, aside from some cracks in buildings. Recently inaugurated President de la Espriella has declared a state of emergency and promised rent subsidies for families who lost their homes. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The earthquake was the strongest to hit Colombia in more than a century. Colombia regularly experiences earthquakes because of its position at the convergence of several tectonic systems, with significant historical seismicity recorded across the Andean and Pacific regions. The Servicio Geológico Colombiano records an average of approximately 2,500 earthquakes per month, equivalent to around 30,000 per year. However, the overwhelming majority are low-magnitude events that are not felt by the population and are detected only instrumentally. Significant damaging earthquakes are considerably less frequent. Notable historical earthquakes include the 1999 Armenia earthquake, a magnitude 6.1 event that killed more than 1,000 people, injured thousands, and caused extensive damage across Colombia's coffee axis. The magnitude 5.5 Popayan earthquake in 1983 killed several hundred people and severely damaged large parts of the city. Meanwhile, the 1979 Tumaco earthquake, with a magnitude of between 7.9 and 8.0, triggered a tsunami, caused widespread building collapses, and killed approximately 600 people. This earthquake will almost certainly act as a test for the new president, Abelardo de la Espriella, who was only recently inaugurated on August 7th. The government's handling of the emergency response, infrastructure disruption, humanitarian assistance, and reconstruction will likely shape initial perceptions of the administration's competence. This is particularly important given de la Espriella's narrow and politically contentious election victory, meaning any perceived shortcomings in the response could quickly become a focus for opposition criticism. More than 100 aftershocks have been recorded. Further aftershocks are highly likely over the coming days and weeks, though they will likely be smaller than the initial earthquake. These could trigger further landslides, damage already weakened buildings and infrastructure, and disrupt transport and emergency operations, particularly in the most heavily affected areas. Now, turning to Europe, Russia's campaign against Ukraine's Black Sea ports is putting increasing pressure on the country's maritime access. Russian forces heavily targeted Odesa Oblast overnight from August 8th to 9th. President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that Odessa seaport was damaged in the attacks, while local authorities reported that dozens of missiles and one-way attack unmanned aerial vehicles struck the city, injuring 12 people. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed it had struck fuel storage facilities at Odessa and Chornomorsk that were being used for Ukrainian military purposes. On August 9th, Russian forces struck the Mayaki Bridge on the M15 Odessa city to Reni Highway. This is the principal road link between the Greater Odesa complex, the Danube port group of Ismail, Reni, and Kilia, and the Moldovan and Romanian borders. Overnight from August 9th to 10th, Russian forces conducted a further attack against Odessa Oblast, which reportedly impacted the Odessa thermal power plant and 7 electrical substations in the surrounding region. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Russian forces have sustained a concentrated missile and one-way attack unmanned aerial vehicle campaign against Ukraine's Black Sea and Danube port infrastructure since early July 2026. This campaign has now effectively suspended commercial maritime traffic through the Greater Odesa port complex. The campaign against Greater Odesa almost certainly constitutes a deliberate effort to disrupt Ukrainian grain and other exports. Russian forces have progressively targeted deep water terminals, vessels calling at those terminals, local power infrastructure, and, now, the alternative land corridor used by Ukraine due to the disruption of maritime routes. The cumulative effect is likely a functional blockade of Ukraine's maritime access through long-range fires. This comes after the Russian Black Sea Fleet was displaced from the Western Black Sea by Ukrainian strike and unmanned surface vessel operations in 2023 and 2024. The high penetration rates observed against Ukrainian air defenses in the south are highly likely attributable to a combination of geography and interceptor allocation. Short flight times from Crimea and launch positions over the Black Sea, combined with the greater difficulty of detecting low-flying projectiles approaching over water, result in very limited warning times. This means that air defense is almost certainly a greater challenge in Odessa Oblast than in other areas such as Kiev. Furthermore, Ukraine is almost certainly suffering from a critical shortage of advanced interceptors. Recent attacks indicate that the temporary easing of Ukraine's interceptor shortage, observed following attacks in mid to late July, has reversed. Ukraine's stockpile of advanced interceptors used in the Patriot system is highly likely now again near exhaustion. These highly limited interceptor stocks are likely concentrated on the defense of Kiev, leaving other urban centers, industrial areas, and critical infrastructure more exposed. Elsewhere in the region, the assassination of a senior military intelligence figure in Libya has raised questions over internal power struggles in the east of the country. On the evening of August 10th, Major General Fawzi al-Mansouri, the head of military intelligence for eastern Libya's Libyan National Army, was killed when an explosive device detonated in his car. The incident took place outside his home in the Hawari area of Benghazi. In a statement condemning the attack, Major General Khalid al-Majoub, director of the LNA's Moral Guidance Department, claimed that the attack recalled the wave of assassinations targeting officers and prominent figures across Libya in 2013 and 2014. He added that those responsible would be brought to justice. No group has claimed responsibility for the attack. The assassination coincides with a series of drone strikes targeting key oil installations in Zawiya, western Libya. One successful strike ignited a large fire at the refinery's gasoline storage tank, as well as at the town's power plant. It also came just over a week after numerous inmates staged a mass escape from Surman jail in western Libya on August 4th. Armed clashes subsequently erupted nearby in the two cities of Zawiya and Surman, west of Tripoli. Fighting between rival armed groups killed 3 civilians and injured several others. Now our intelligence team's assessment. While the October 2020 ceasefire that ended the country's second civil war in less than a decade has largely held, Libya remains politically divided and heavily militarized, with rival governments controlling different parts of the country. Western Libya, including the capital, Tripoli, is governed by the Government of National Unity, headed by Prime Minister Abdul Hamid Dbeibah. Eastern Libya is controlled by the Benghazi-based LNA, led by Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar. Libya's economy is dependent on oil. While much of the production infrastructure and many oil fields lie in LNA-controlled territory, the major financial institutions have historically operated from Tripoli. This means LNA and GNU-linked elites depend on one another to keep oil exports and revenues flowing. While the assassination of al-Mansouri, the drone strikes, and the prison break in Zawiya and Saman are almost certainly not operationally linked, they almost certainly demonstrate the ongoing fragility in Libya. In western Libya, numerous armed groups exist and are formally tied to state bodies, such as the Ministries of Defense or Interior, while maintaining independent leadership, territories, and economic interests. Rival armed groups frequently fight over local checkpoints, economic leverage, and detention facilities. Tensions are currently increasing between the GNU and warlord Mohammed Bahroun, who holds considerable influence in the city of Zawiya, as the GNU attempts to impose greater control over armed actors that have historically operated semi-independently. The clashes following the prison break should be seen in this context, with rival factions competing not only over local security infrastructure, but also over influence within the GNU's broader effort to consolidate control across western Libya. Further clashes in and around Zawiya are highly likely. Al-Mansouri's assassination almost certainly undermines the narrative that Benghazi is politically stable and secure in comparison with western Libya. The assassination likely reflects ongoing power struggles within the LNA. The attack occurred amid mounting uncertainty over succession within the LNA, and therefore raises the possibility that intra-LNA rivalries were likely responsible. Given al-Mansouri's profile, an assassination would highly likely require knowledge of his security arrangements and movements, reinforcing this assessment. Alternatively, the LNA has explicitly framed the method of attack as one used by jihadist groups. Al-Mansouri played an important role in the LNA's campaigns against jihadist organizations, including Islamic State, between 2014 and 2017. However, no group has claimed responsibility. Turning to the Middle East, efforts to de-escalate tensions in southern Lebanon have stalled as Israeli military operations increase. On August 6th, the 7th round of Israel-Lebanon talks concluded at the U.S. Embassy in Rome. U.S. officials described the talks as constructive, despite a failure to agree on the implementation of the pilot zones framework. This would involve the withdrawal of the Israel Defense Forces from some areas of southern Lebanon and their replacement by the Lebanese armed forces. On August 11th, U.S. channels stated that the next round of talks would be held in early September. Unverified reports on August 12th indicated that the two sides may have reached an agreement on establishing a verification mechanism to assess LAF progress in clearing IDF-vacated pilot zones, with responsibility assigned to military officials from a third country. IDF operations in southern Lebanon continued between August 6th and 13th. The areas with the highest levels of military activity included areas east of Nabateh, the vicinity of Hadatha, and the area between Mansouri and Majd al-Zun. On August 7th, an Israeli drone reportedly struck an LAF bulldozer near Mansouri, wounding one Lebanese soldier. On August 12th, LAF channels published a statement condemning Israeli military operations for violating existing agreements and international laws. The following day, Lebanese Prime Minister Nawaf Salam echoed this criticism, reporting that IDF troops had destroyed several private residential structures during clearance operations in southern Lebanon. The increased tempo of Israeli operations in southern Lebanon follows an August 5th incident in which 2 Israeli soldiers were killed by an improvised explosive device in Tyre district. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The latest round of talks in Rome likely demonstrated the ongoing difficulties in implementing the pilot zones plan, which remains the key point of friction between the Israeli and Lebanese sides in their efforts to end the conflict. Israeli officials almost certainly assess that, under current circumstances, the LAF does not have the capacity or willingness to fulfill its mandate to disarm Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and prevent the militia from re-infiltrating previously cleared areas. U.S. officials are likely seeking to expedite the implementation of the pilot zones framework, as the conflict in Lebanon likely remains one of the key potential obstacles to a comprehensive agreement with Iran to end the current conflict. Highlighting this effort, international media reported on August 10th that U.S. Central Command Chief Admiral Brad Cooper told his Israeli counterparts that the U.S. leadership aims to make tangible progress in closing the 3 fronts of the war, referring to Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. There is a realistic possibility that the U.S. will take a more active role in supporting deconfliction in Lebanon, for instance, by taking responsibility for monitoring the implementation of the pilot zones program through a limited deployment of personnel in an advisory role. However, due to the political costs associated with such a move, it is more likely that this role will be taken by a U.S.-friendly country that already has a presence in Lebanon through the UNIFIL framework. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, Israeli settler activity is increasingly expanding beyond Area C. Clashes between Israeli settlers, IDF troops, and Palestinian residents continued across the West Bank during this reporting period. Between August 10th and 12th, IDF troops carried out operations in Jenin, Balata, Kalkilia, near Bethlehem, Beitunia, Nablus, Al-Arub, Taysir, and Al-Bireh, among other areas. In Kusra, a village just south of Nablus, settler groups reportedly erected a makeshift outpost in a Palestinian area, consisting of tents and rocks used to block the road leading to the village. On August 12th, IDF troops clashed with settlers while attempting to dismantle the outpost, before withdrawing and leaving the settler groups in place. On August 11th, UN Deputy Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Ramiz Al-Akbarov, claimed that Israeli settler and military operations have resulted in 76 deaths and the displacement of approximately 3,800 Palestinians so far in 2026. He also reported increasing activity in areas A and B, rather than the more usual Area C. The three areas, established under the 1995 Oslo II Accords, entail varying degrees of Palestinian jurisdiction. Area A, corresponding to 18% of West Bank territory, is under full Palestinian Authority control. Area B, comprising 22%, is administered by the PA, with security control shared with Israel. Area C, comprising the remaining 60%, is under full Israeli administration. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The current period of intensified activity in the West Bank began after a firefight near the village of Tel in late July, which killed 6 people. However, while the late July incident triggered the recent operations, they more broadly reflect trends that have been ongoing throughout 2026, marked by the expansion of both the scope and extent of newly approved settlements. Israeli settler operations in Area C are aimed at expanding an already large settler presence, with around 500,000 Israeli nationals living across more than 130 sites. In February 2026, however, the Israeli government approved a set of measures that removed restrictions on the creation of settlements in the other 2 areas. These measures almost certainly created the conditions for the intensification of settler and IDF operations in Areas A and B during the second half of the year. Moreover, in July, the Israeli government approved 34 settlements, including some that had been established years earlier but were previously declared illegal. This likely legitimized settler attempts to establish outposts or small footholds near Palestinian villages, with the Kusra case likely demonstrating this growing trend. The heightened rate of settler activity in the West Bank will likely continue in the short to medium term. In addition to the more permissive judicial environment, the upcoming October elections likely further favor this trend. The Netanyahu government coalition includes several parties, such as Religious Zionism and Otzma Yehudit, which count settlers among their key electoral demographics. With current polls indicating that the governing coalition will fall short of a parliamentary majority, it is unlikely that the government will risk alienating a core electoral bloc. Elsewhere in the region, attention is turning to the United States and Iran as the 60-day truce period approaches its August 17th deadline. On August 8th, the now former Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Mohammad Bagher Zolgadeh, stated that the Strait of Hormuz would not reopen until 6 conditions were met: an end to U.S. threats against Iran, a permanent end to attacks against Iran and its allies in Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, and Iraq, the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade and the withdrawal of U.S. naval and air forces from around Iran, full compensation for damage caused during the war, the lifting of sanctions, and the unconditional release of frozen Iranian assets. Iran's Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, stated on August 9th that an agreement with Oman was close, but that reopening the Strait of Hormuz remained conditional on the fulfillment of other conditions, which had been conveyed to the U.S. side through intermediaries. Also, on August 9th, former Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Commander-in-Chief Mohsen Rezaieh was appointed Secretary of the SNSC, replacing Zolgadeh. U.S. President Donald Trump stated on August 9th that the U.S. was low-keying it and only semi-negotiating with Iran. On August 10th, President Trump rejected Iran's demand for compensation and stated that he had instructed U.S. representatives to instead seek compensation from Iran. On August 12th, citing Pakistani government sources, Turkish state-run media reported that the U.S. and Iran had agreed to extend the 60-day ceasefire set out in the Memorandum of Understanding ahead of its expiry on August 17th. However, the length of the extension had reportedly not yet been agreed. After this report was published, a senior Iranian source conversely told international media that no talks on extending the ceasefire had taken place. The source said Tehran's position remained that Washington must first return to the provisions of the Memorandum of Understanding and define a timeframe for implementing its commitments. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Tehran's insistence that an arrangement with Oman will not, by itself, reopen the Strait of Hormuz likely reflects an intent to retain that leverage until wider concessions are secured. However, the demanded concessions are maximalist and are highly unlikely to be accepted by Washington. The competing US and Iranian maritime blockades continue as of August 13th, with President Trump's statements about low-keying it, with Iran referring to continued economic pressure against the regime rather than major combat operations. The Trump administration currently highly likely regards the US blockade as its primary means of exerting leverage over Tehran to compel compliance. Likewise, Tehran almost certainly sees disruption to transit through the Strait of Hormuz as its primary form of leverage. US CENTCOM has previously conducted limited strikes against Iran following Iranian attacks on vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. These have typically been followed by Iranian retaliatory strikes against targets in regional states, particularly US military targets in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain. However, while Iranian attacks have continued against vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz near Oman, outside Iran's enforced routes, these attacks have not recently been followed by US strikes. This likely reflects the Trump administration's current prioritization of avoiding a full return to conflict and instead attempting to secure the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz through the ongoing Iran-Oman talks. US freedom of action against Iran has highly likely been constrained by the considerable depletion of US offensive and defensive munitions during the war. While unlikely to be willing to accept Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz over the longer term, there is a realistic possibility that the Trump administration calculates that a reprieve of 60 days or more on Strait of Hormuz transit will enable US forces to replenish munitions ahead of any future renewed operations against Iran. The continued divergence in Iran's negotiating position among different figures is likely attributable to factional competition in Tehran. The replacement of Zolgadeh with Rezai on August 9th likely reflects a consolidation of control around figures staunchly opposed to any concessions to the US. The absence of a fully coherent regime in Tehran almost certainly complicates the negotiation process. It also increases the likelihood that elements within the IRGC could fail to comply with or purposely undermine any agreement reached by Iran's civilian government and negotiating teams, as observed after the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding. Iranian forces have almost certainly exploited any cessation of US strikes to improve their offensive and defensive positions. This has likely involved the excavation of ballistic missiles and ballistic missile launchers, the importation of new equipment, and the restoration of damaged systems. Iranian military units are likely to regroup, disperse remaining assets, and reposition forces to further enhance their survivability against future strikes. This would also place Iran in a better position to conduct large-scale attacks against regional targets should regular active fighting resume. Fundamentally, the conflict has likely now entered a lower intensity phase, in which neither party currently assesses that renewed large-scale operations are in its interests. The US is highly likely constrained by munitions shortages and is ostensibly prioritizing economic pressure through the blockade. Meanwhile, Tehran is almost certainly exploiting the pause to regenerate its capabilities while retaining the closure of the Strait of Hormuz as its principal source of leverage. Consequently, a formal lapse of the 60-day truce period on August 17th is unlikely in itself to trigger an immediate resumption of large-scale strikes. A de facto pause would likely persist without any publicly declared extension. However, the situation almost certainly remains fragile, with multiple potential triggers for rapid escalation, particularly the ongoing maritime blockades. And staying in the region, escalating Houthi activity and threats from Iran-backed militias are increasing pressure on Saudi Arabia. On August 7th, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, a coalition of Iran-backed Iraqi militias announced the postponement of scheduled retaliatory operations against US and Saudi targets following an appeal by Iraqi political leaders. The IRI stated that the decision constituted only a postponement. This was reinforced on August 8 by the Secretary-General of the militia group, Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, who said the planned response had been delayed, but not abandoned. Iraqi security forces were placed on alert ahead of the expiry of the IRI's deadline. The threatened strikes are a response to joint US-Saudi strikes against Popular Mobilization Forces positions in Iraq on July 29, which killed at least 20 people, including several Iranian advisors. On August 7, Iraqi Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi met Khalid al-Humaydan, the head of Saudi Arabia's General Intelligence Presidency. Al-Zaidi stated that Iraq would not permit its territory to be used to launch attacks against other states. No attacks originating from Iraqi territory were reported between August 6 and August 13. Fighting in Yemen between the Houthis and forces of the Saudi-backed, internationally recognized government continued and escalated between August 6 and August 13 across Marib, Hadramaut, Al-Jawf, and Taiz governorates. This included repeated Houthi ballistic missile and unmanned aerial vehicle attacks against the IRG-held port of Mocha and the city of Marib between August 9 and August 11. On August 7, the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Hans Grunberg, stated that Yemen faces a greater risk of renewed large-scale conflict than at any point since the UN brokered truce of April 2022. On August 9, a Houthi spokesperson stated that its forces had struck Saudi Aramco's Jazan refinery with an attack drone, following reports of a fire at the facility. No injuries were reported as a result of the attack. On August 11, the Houthis attacked a Tanzania-flagged cargo vessel in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, killing at least 6 crew members. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The claimed postponement of Iraqi militia retaliation on August 7 was likely a product of Iraqi domestic political pressure. It likely reflects the interest of Shia Coordination Framework parties in avoiding further US-Saudi strikes and protecting the PMF's position ahead of the government's September 30 deadline for placing all weapons under state control. The IRI has explicitly stated that the decision is a deferral, and Iraqi militias almost certainly retain both the capability and intent to strike Saudi and US targets. Any resumption would highly likely occur with minimal indicators and warnings. Attacks originating from Iraqi territory would most likely target energy infrastructure in Saudi Arabia's eastern province and Riyadh, replicating the drone attacks that Riyadh attributed to Iraqi militias in late July. There is a realistic possibility that these attacks would be deliberately coordinated with Houthi attacks from the south. Simultaneous attacks from both northern and southern axes would likely force Saudi Arabia to disperse aircraft, radar, and air defense systems across multiple directions. This could potentially overstretch Saudi air defenses and expose gaps in coverage. Continued Houthi attacks against Saudi-linked vessels, southern Saudi Arabia, and Saudi-backed Yemeni IRG forces almost certainly demonstrate the continued high risk of kinetic exchanges between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. This escalated conflict will highly likely persist for as long as the Houthi maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia remains in force, regardless of the status of broader negotiations with Iran. The August 9th strike against the Jazan refinery highly likely indicates that the Houthis are continuing to target Saudi energy infrastructure, with further such attacks likely in the coming weeks. This assessment is further reinforced by warnings from Houthi media on August 11th that attacks against Saudi energy infrastructure would be expanded if Saudi Arabia continues to stall diplomatic efforts. Such attacks are highly likely to be the primary form of leverage the Houthis can impose against Saudi Arabia. The intensification of Houthi operations against IRG forces and cities is almost certainly the most significant escalation in the Yemeni civil war since the 2022 truce. The concentration of fighting in Marib, Al-Jaf and Taiz corresponds closely to the axes along which Houthi forces were advancing before the truce. The use of ballistic missiles and UAVs against Marib city and the port of Mocha likely indicates an intent to degrade Saudi-backed IRG command, logistics and maritime resupply in preparation for potential full-scale renewed fighting. It also likely indicates an intention to deter a potential Saudi-backed ground offensive against the Houthis. The most likely trigger for a major escalation remains a Saudi-backed IRG ground offensive against Houthi-controlled Yemen. However, a Houthi preemptive offensive to seize Marib before IRG forces can be reconstituted is also a realistic possibility. Both scenarios would highly likely result in a substantial escalation in cross-border missile and drone attacks against southern Saudi Arabia. The Houthis would likely target airports, military bases, energy infrastructure, and population centers in Jazan, Asir, and Najran. Deeper Houthi attacks against targets in Riyadh, Jeddah, and other parts of Saudi Arabia would also be highly likely. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, Indonesia is facing a worsening wildfire season as El Niño brings increasingly dry conditions. On August 11th, Indonesia increased efforts to contain multiple ongoing forest and land fires. The largest wildfire is in Bromo Tengah Semeru National Park, where approximately 899 hectares of land have burned, including grassland and other vegetation. Fires have also spread to the Penanjakan area, a popular tourist viewpoint. Fires have been reported across multiple provinces, including Jambi, South Sumatra, West Kalimantan, Central Kalimantan, South Kalimantan, and Riau. However, the fires were mostly contained by August 12th. The resulting haze has also affected parts of Malaysia, pushing the air pollution index in some areas of Sarawak into the unhealthy category. More than 48,000 firefighters and disaster personnel have been deployed, alongside dozens of helicopters. Cloud-seeding aircraft have also been deployed to induce rain. According to officials, deep peat soil, limited water supplies, difficult access and strong winds have complicated relief efforts. Indonesia's forestry ministry has stated that more than 107,000 hectares of land were burned between January and June this year. August and September are expected to be the months with the highest wildfire risk. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Indonesia's 2026 wildfire season is highly likely to be exacerbated by the impacts of El Niño, which typically extends and intensifies the country's dry season from July to September. Indonesia's Meteorology, Climatology and Geophysics Agency predicts dry conditions across parts of Sumatra, Kalimantan, Java and Papua, although the impacts will vary geographically. El Niño brings changes in winds, air pressure and rainfall patterns, typically causing drier conditions across Southeast Asia. The previous El Niño helped make 2023 and 2024 two of the hottest global years on record. The principal short-term hazard is almost certainly further forest and land fires. Persistently dry vegetation, reduced soil moisture, and limited rainfall will create conditions conducive to ignition and rapid fire spread, particularly across Sumatra and Kalimantan, where peatland fires can be especially difficult to contain. Increased fire activity would likely place additional pressure on emergency services, disrupt transport and economic activity, and worsen air quality. There is also a realistic possibility of significant haze affecting neighboring Singapore and Malaysia should sustained fires coincide with favorable wind conditions. This would likely impact air quality. The intensified dry conditions mean there will almost certainly also be significant second-order impacts. Reduced water availability poses risks to agriculture, reservoirs and hydropower, as well as food production and prices, and drinking water supplies. These pressures also increase the risk of protests, particularly where water shortages, rising food prices, or disruption to livelihoods exacerbate existing socio-economic grievances. While such pressures are unlikely to trigger widespread unrest independently, they could act as catalysts for localized demonstrations, particularly in urban areas or agricultural communities already facing economic strain. And finally, further unrest is likely in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, after voting was postponed in several constituencies. On August 10th, the third and intended final round of voting took place in Pakistan-administered Kashmir's Legislative Assembly elections. However, polling took place in only 4 of the 11 constituencies originally scheduled to participate. Elections in the remaining 7 constituencies, 5 in Poonch and 2 in Sudnoti district, were postponed. The unrest has involved road closures, curfews, restrictions on movement, and an internet and communications blackout. As of August 13th, the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz had secured 25 of the 53 seats in the Azad Jammu and Kashmir Legislative Assembly. The party was expected to increase its representation through at least 2 further rounds of voting, as well as through the subsequent allocation of reserved seats. A PMLN victory would return the party to power for the first time in over a decade. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The postponement of voting has left the electoral process incomplete, prolonging uncertainty over the final composition of the Legislative Assembly and delaying the point at which a definitive majority can be established. A rerun at 23 polling stations across 2 additional constituencies is scheduled for August 15th because of electoral irregularities. The 7 constituencies in Poonch and Sudnoti still do not have a confirmed polling date. The clashes have been driven by the Joint Awami Action Committee, or JAAC, a protest coalition opposed to the continued reservation of 12 legislative assembly seats for people classified as refugees from Indian-administered Kashmir who reside elsewhere in Pakistan. The arrangement has disproportionately benefited the PMLN, which has historically secured most of these seats. In response, the JAAC has called for an electoral boycott and led weeks of protests. The first round of voting in late July saw more than 30 people reportedly killed in Rawalakot during clashes between protesters and security forces, although Pakistani authorities disputed the reported death toll. Overall, violence during the JAAC-led protests has killed more than 50 people, according to human rights groups. The regional government banned the JAAC in June 2026 under counter-terrorism legislation, citing security and public order concerns. Further JAAC-led violence is highly likely in the near term, particularly around the outstanding votes in Poonch and Sudnoti. Previous unrest has resulted in fatalities, road closures, curfews, communications restrictions, and the deployment of additional security personnel. Further attempts to restrict demonstrations or enforce polling arrangements are likely to generate renewed confrontations. Furthermore, the postponement of polling is likely to result in allegations of electoral manipulation, which could trigger further demonstrations following the publication of the official results. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.